Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we are digging into the ending of No Time to Die, that is the death of Daniel Craig's James Bond. But before we begin, I want you to just take a moment, take a deep breath, just take a moment to digest your emotions, to distance yourself from your initial reaction, because I want you to embark on an imaginative exercise with me. I've been giving myself a project for the past few weeks, and I want you to come alongside me in this journey. Today, we are not going to discuss whether or not Bond should have died in No Time to Die. That's a controversial question. It probably deserves its own video, its own exploration, but that's not what we're talking about today. That's not this conversation. That's out of scope for this video. That's out of scope for what we're doing here together. What we are going to explore here together is if we have to kill James Bond at the end of No Time to Die, what is the best way to do it? After all, it was decided very early on, as soon as Daniel Craig was back on board for this movie, that James Bond had to die at the ending. And every variation of the project, with all its different scripts, all its different creative personnel, they were all in support of this ending. But just saying that James Bond has to die isn't an ending. Not all deaths are created equal. How James Bond dies is really the question. And I want to take time to just sit with that imaginatively, because I never really thought the series would kill James Bond. I never thought, when the rumors cropped up before No Time to Die was released, that there was anything serious to the idea that James Bond would die at the end of No Time to Die. I thought that was just tabloid fluff. But it happened, and it must have been a very interesting experience to be on the creative team and have that handed to you as a core requirement, and having to kind of map a story out around that fixed star. I've spent the past few weeks in my free time just mapping out different ways that I would approach that problem. They say that the absence of limitations is the death of creativity. And in some ways, it's liberating to work with constraints. So how creative can we be together? How can we make the best version of this idea that we can, even if it's an idea that we wouldn't necessarily choose for ourselves? I don't think director Cary Fukunaga, when he came on board the project after the departure of Danny Boyle, necessarily would have chosen this for himself. He was very clear in interviews that No Time to Die did not represent his vision for Bond, that he really saw himself as a servant of the broader creative team in pulling that movie together. And if we adopt that posture, if we say, this is the assignment, how do we deliver the best version of that assignment? It raises some interesting questions. So when presented with a quandary around James Bond, as a fan of the novels, I'm always inclined to go look at what Ian Fleming did first. And that is both helpful and unhelpful here. Ian Fleming did try to kill James Bond off partway through the series. At the end of From Russia with Love, Bond finishes his mission, but is poisoned by Rosa Klebb in his climactic fight with her. And the novel ends with Bond falling into unconsciousness and death. And Ian Fleming fully intended to kill the character there, though he was persuaded to resurrect Bond for the next installment. Ian Fleming further toyed with that idea in subsequent stories. I think You Only Live Twice, his novel, which is nothing like the movie. If your only reference point for You Only Live Twice is the movie, the book is completely its own entity. It gets very close to killing James Bond. At the end of You Only Live Twice, Bond has suffered great amnesia, is living in a Japanese fishing village, and hears a Russian word, and that makes him remember that there's something to that. And so he departs to Soviet Russia, and probably his death at the end of that book. That book is a book fixated on the question of death, and Bond even gets an obituary in that novel. So it really felt like an end cap for the character, even though the character would again reemerge in the next installment. So there's some precedent here, and it seems like that precedent was even followed a little bit in No Time to Die. Just like at the end of From Russia with Love, Bond is poisoned at the last second. He has the rug pulled out from under him after he thinks he's achieved something approaching victory, and then dies. But Fleming's sensibilities, first and foremost, are very different from that of what became the Daniel Craig era. The Daniel Craig era is pulling from a lot of Ian Fleming reference points, but the Craig era is much more melodramatic and theatrical, and one might even say operatic, especially in the way No Time to Die treats this concept, whereas Fleming was a little bit more aloof, and there is a bitter, ironic quality to the way that he deals with tragedy in his novels. His novels have a lot of tragic elements in them. They're not all exuberant, fun Bond adventures like the bulk of the movies are, but the tang of bitter sadness in Ian Fleming is a little softer. It's more quintessentially British in its reserved nature. Fleming's Bond is a very different character than even Daniel Craig's James Bond. Fleming's Bond is a professional spy. The idea that eventually death would catch up with Ian Fleming's James Bond is not unreasonable in the context of those stories. If you're reading those books together, it's not unreasonable that that character would meet some sort of demise. But the cinematic Bond is much more indestructible, and even Daniel Craig, this particularly human incarnation of James Bond, is still just a bulldozer of a human being. This is a character who bursts through walls, survives miraculously being shot off bridges and falling into rivers where probably he would have drowned. You know, this is a character who has an aura of indestructibility about him. So the mode of storytelling that Ian Fleming inhabits does not map one-to-one with the Daniel Craig era, especially with the way Spectre left things up in the air. So that left me thinking about Daniel Craig's version of the character, because really, if you are going to give that character finale, you really have to understand that character and what drives that character. So I began thinking about Daniel Craig's version of the character and what defines that version of the character. And I think in many ways, Daniel Craig's Bond is this just unstoppable force, this sort of relentless presence. When you give Daniel Craig's Bond a target, he goes in a straight line after it. And you definitely see that in the film No Time to Die a little bit once he gets his groove back and is back in the game, that he is kind of relentlessly focused on getting to the end of this mission that he's essentially given himself in No Time to Die. But I think it's a little bit different than that. He is not allowed to really confront the specter of death in the story No Time to Die. In No Time to Die as a movie, it really treats death as a final rug pull. Bond's mission is to save his family and stop Safin and the release of this nanobot virus, which we'll talk about in a second. Those achievements are kind of undercut by this final twist that, oh, you were right on the cusp of victory, Bond, but here is this very tragic ending that's going to deny you the happiness you thought you were going to get. The ending of No Time to Die is particularly dispiriting, I think, in its twist there, because not only is that a final rug pull, it's a surprise to Bond, the character. He's not really given much time to reckon with what's going on there, and neither is the audience. But his victory feels a little hollow. The one thing we trust Bond to do as a character is save the day. That is the stereotype for James Bond, is he is the character who saves the world. And in concept, Bond is saving the world in No Time to Die, but it doesn't feel like Bond has saved the world at the end of No Time to Die. And I think that's really a problem of plotting and exposition. The nanobot virus is actually a perfectly good idea for a villain plot for these movies. In fact, it calls back to the Blofeld virus plot of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This is territory the series can play in, but it's so weirdly technical and finicky in its rules, and I don't think a lot of people understand what nanobots even are, that in many cases nanobots are not really like electrical machines anymore, but are actually built from organic components. That's one reason I think at Safin's base you're seeing them harvest it rather than just engineer it in a conventional way. There's this very complicated technical baggage associated with that, and it's very abstract, and the countdown clock at the end of the movie is very abstract in its own way. People are just coming to buy the weapon and presumably use it. There's no countdown to true doomsday. It's just like a few steps removed from doomsday. The threat Bond is trying to resolve is just to stop the weapon from getting out into the world. And he doesn't even really get a dramatic moment of just saving his family in a very active way. He obviously, comes to save them, but there's not a heroic valedictory moment where he really gets to show his might. And I think in some ways the flaw there in the movie's version of that ending is a bit more order of operations. The way they sequence all those events there in the climax, Bond getting to the base, Bond trying to locate his family, Bond rescuing his family and then sending them on their way, and then Bond going into John Wick mode for a little bit and seemingly having a victorious moment, and then finally confronting the villain and having this kind of sad, bitter scene where the villain actually gets the last laugh over Bond there. The sequence just feels a little wrong. Like, if Bond came into that guns blazing and, really rescued his family in a way that was bold and sacrificial, it would be a little different. But I want to revisit this idea of the rug pull altogether. And I also want to revisit, these concepts that are at play in the finale. You really have all these pieces in No Time to Die. You have Bond's family. You have Safin, the villain. You have this virus. And you have Bond. And I toyed with just kind of totally altering the landscape, but in the amount of time I gave myself to prepare for this video, whenever I sat down to just dream up an altogether new third act for this movie, it was just too daunting. So let's leave those pieces in play for the most part. But I am going to say we should take Safin out of the picture here. I don't think Safin makes sense in this story. I think the villain always should have been Blofeld. And I know I say all, I know most of us had mixed feelings about Blofeld in the prior film, Spectre. But No Time to Die had already committed to bringing the character back and had already committed to making the character interesting, as well as to giving Madeline, who is also a fairly thin character in Spectre, a lot more dramatic depth and heft. And if you're going to make that commitment to Madeline, I think it only makes sense to make that commitment to Blofeld. Blofeld is the character with a history with Bond. Blofeld is the maniac arch nemesis. It doesn't make sense to introduce this new character that you have to really build these mechanics around. It really makes sense to just have Blofeld at the center of this, Blofeld building this mega weapon virus that he can use to just essentially do what we know Blofeld does, blackmail the world into submission. If you have a mega virus that can just destroy an entire group of people, an entire race, an entire nationality just by destroying their entire genetic chain, Blofeld is suddenly king of the world. And emboldened after the events of Spectre, a vengeance-hungry Blofeld is probably a more interesting figure to watch than he ever was in Spectre, or even in the scene he has in No Time to Die, which I think Christoph Waltz does a good job given the material he's done, where he plays his like kind of Hannibal Lecter thing. That sort of vengeful, spiteful Blofeld, I think, works a lot better in the context of this dramatic story, because it gives Bond someone he has a relationship with and is this enemy that he can really crusade against in a way that is going to connect more than this more enigmatic figure who Bond has not engaged with before. Similarly, I think you have to simplify the virus a little bit here. I think the virus just needs to be a clearer concept. Just stick to standard bioweapon technology stuff. To drop the verbiage of nanobots. If it's just a virus that targets certain genetic strains, it's clean, it's simple, audiences will be able to follow it. That's fine. It's a great threat. But make the threat more monumental. Say, for example, if Blofeld is holding the world for ransom, maybe he's using one part of the world for demonstration because the world will not believe him until he's done it. And he has picked, for all we know, Great Britain to do so, and is going to disperse the virus there. There's a lot of different ways you can play that, but I think that gives you a stronger villain that the characters already have relationships to. You don't have to establish a new backstory for Madeline either. Blofeld already has that connection there, so it streamlines a lot, and it also gives you a countdown clock that is a lot stronger. But that's all, just technical details. So that's all just window dressing in a way for what needed to be a larger change. And the change is Bond's overall arc. I think the arc of Bond coming out of retirement, having this happy moment, and then getting everything stolen from him at the last second is so punishing for this character. It doesn't even really feel in line with the Craig era. The Craig era has plenty of tragedy in it, as everybody has noted. The ending of Casino Royale is dark. The ending of Quantum of Solace gets pretty dark. He almost, dispatches himself and Camille in a moment of despair in Quantum of Solace. I've always found that ending really soul-crushing in a way that other people don't seem to, but I find the ending of Quantum of Solace really kind of to be a serious gut punch. Skyfall has M's death. Spectre is the only thing approaching a happy ending in the Craig series. So tragedy being part of this is expected, but this sort of way that Bond is really given this potential exit from this cycle of violence, and then at the last second is just kind of denied. There's a kind of sadism in that I think doesn't sit well with what I like about Daniel Craig's version of Bond. He is the forceful, indestructible Bond, and I think you had an opportunity here to make the story about Bond confronting death and playing this game with death and still achieving some measure of victory against it. And by that, I mean that when we are confronted with death, the big thing death takes away from us is not just our life, but our opportunity to achieve our goals, right? And if Bond's goal is a little bit different than it is in No Time to Die, you can have this sense of victory where Bond essentially gets to outrun the clock. We've seen that in other series with other heroes where heroes know they're going to die in advance and they're working with that knowledge, but they are giving everything they've got. They know that death is coming for them, but they're going to do all they can so that death doesn't cheat them of their opportunity to make one last great stand. And I think that's denied to Daniel Craig's Bond. He doesn't know death is coming for him, so he doesn't actually, as a character, get to measure himself against that. So if you had a mechanism by which Bond is poisoned earlier in the story and knows that he's on borrowed time and is trying to make the most of it, he's trying to defend what is there of his family just to make sure they have a future for them. He is trying to stop Blofeld to save the world in what would be the biggest villain scheme of the entire Craig run. This true global apocalyptic threat. You can get a lot out of that, and you can start to magnify that in certain ways. One of the pieces that the movie does pull from Fleming is this concept of the Garden of Death. And in Ian Fleming's novel, You Only Live Twice, where that's from, Bond is really there confronting death vividly. He has to navigate the Garden of Death. And I think you could have had this really grand climax where Bond comes into Blofeld's base, guns blazing, is just John Wick style from the outset, because that's what we know Daniel Craig's Bond to be, and we just watch him be a machine at it. And then we have to watch him overcome Blofeld's machinations as Blofeld holds Bond's love and child ransom while Bond has to navigate the Garden of Death like a kind of obstacle course. We've already seen Blofeld want to treat Bond sadistically, and Bond overcomes that. He's not going to be taken down by that. And even at the last second, when Blofeld is trying to destroy the world, Bond isn't going to let him have that either. And Bond dies in a final act, preventing this doomsday machine from obliterating a nation or something of that scale. I think that gets a level of emotional resonance that is a little bit more genuinely bittersweet as opposed to just bitter, which is what I think the ending of No Time to Die is. If you could give Bond and Blofeld this dramatic fight where he really gets that sort of die Blofeld die moment in the climax as opposed to this mid-movie ending to an interrogation sequence, I think you start to have a little bit more there. I think you give that character a little bit more ability to understand his playing field and confront death a little bit more directly. And if his death is really something that he chooses to do because he knows, A, he's operating on borrowed time, but B, in doing this, he is kind of giving death one final middle finger on his way out by saving the world one last time. I think that feels a little bit more correct for both Daniel Craig's James Bond, who is an isolated, distinct character, this sort of unstoppable force of a Bond that we've seen, and also feels a little bit more appropriate as what that film now stands as, which is the end cap to the entire Eon Productions run. It really feels like the character should have gotten to go out at least partially on his own terms. So, having said all of that, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you all because I want to know your ideas. I've racked my brain over this, and I've really only spent 2 weeks on this. That movie was developed over months and months and months and many iterations, so I'm not sure where I'd land if I really focused on this for, as a dedicated project for the better part of a year. I might come up with a very different answer, but I would be very curious to hear if you were to take the same exercise upon yourself and try to imagine the best version of the ending of No Time to Die, in which Daniel Craig's Bond still dies. So, that said, I look forward to chatting with you all in the comments, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.